Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world.
And today we are conducting a structural analysis of an institution so ubiquitous, so fundamental to our daily existence, that we really rarely stop to question its design.
We're talking about work,
Right.
specifically the invisible architecture of the workplace.
Yeah.
It's a strange paradox. We spend the vast majority of our waking lives inside these institutions.
Yeah, you get up, you commute, you clock in.
You work, you clock out.
Yeah.
And we do this for 40, maybe 50 years. And yet, we almost never analyze the workplace as a political system.
Exactly.
We talk about democracy in our neighborhoods, in our cities, in our country. But when we walk through the office doors, that democracy usually stops at the threshold.
It really does. It's like crossing a border into a completely different kind of country entirely.
It is. And that is the entry point for the text we are analyzing in our deep dive today. It's Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism by Richard Wolff.
Now, before we go any further into the material, I want to set the analytical lens for you.
Right, because this isn't a book review.
No, not at all. We are not here to review a book or do a critique of the prose or, a biographical sketch of the author. We are performing a systems-level analysis of how production is organized.
We are treating the modern workplace as a machine.
Exactly. We're stripping away the paint and looking at the gears to see why it spins the way it does.
So the mission here is to look under the hood. And Wolff's central argument is pretty provocative right out of the gate.
It is. He suggests that when we talk about economic crises, whether it's the crash of 2008 or wealth inequality or the stagnation of wages, we're usually looking at the wrong things entirely.
We're arguing about markets,
Right.
or we're arguing about taxes or regulation.
And Wolff says those are all surface-level mechanisms. If you want to understand why the economy functions the way it does, you have to look at the core unit of analysis.
Which is the organization of production itself.
Yes. He argues that we are facing a crisis in perception because we fail to see that the specific design of the enterprise creates mathematical certainties.
The internal structure of the business.
Exactly. The thesis here is that the problems we face aren't glitches in the system. They aren't errors. They are the predictable outcomes of a very specific design feature.
And that feature is the separation of the production of surplus from the appropriation of surplus.
Yes.
Okay, let's unpack that immediately because the separation of production from appropriation, that sounds highly technical, almost academic.
It does, but it's actually the heartbeat of this entire analysis.
To get there, though, I think we first have to do something that feels a bit remedial, but is actually crucial.
Redefining capitalism.
Exactly. We have to redefine what we mean by capitalism. Because if you stop 10 people on the street and ask them, what is capitalism?
You'd get 10 variations of, well, it's about private property.
Or it's about free markets.
Right. Or it's just buying and selling things.
And Wolff explicitly rejects those definitions as insufficient.
He points out that markets, just the exchange of goods and services, existed long before capitalism.
You had vibrant markets in feudal Europe.
You had markets in the slave systems of antiquity. You could buy a toga in Rome or a plow in feudal France. The market is just a distribution mechanism.
It's not the definition of the system itself.
And the same goes for private property. Feudal lords owned land. Slave masters owned people and tools. So if markets and property aren't the defining feature, what is?
Right. If I can buy a loaf of bread in ancient Rome and a loaf of bread in New York City, the act of buying it isn't what makes the system capitalist. So we have to look deeper.
We have to look at the internal organization of the enterprise. Wolff breaks it down into a very simple, almost physics-like formula regarding human effort.
This is the mechanics of the machine.
Let's visualize the workplace then. Imagine a group of people workers interacting with tools and raw materials.
Okay.
They apply their brain and muscle power for a set amount of time, and in that time, they produce a total output.
Let's keep it simple. Let's say they produce 1,000 widgets in a day.
Good. Now, that output has a monetary value. Let's say it's $1,000 for the sake of the math.
Okay, so I've put in my sweat equity, I've used the machine, and there is now $1,000 worth of stuff sitting on the loading dock.
Now, look at what happens to that value. A portion of that output, or the value of that output, goes back to the workers in the form of wages.
Wolff calls this the sustenance portion.
Right. It's the amount of value the worker needs to receive to buy food, pay rent, clothe themselves, and essentially be able to come back to work the next day and do it all again.
Okay, so I produce $1,000 worth of stuff, and I get paid, say, $200 in wages.
Right.
That covers my life. It keeps the engine running, the engine being me.
Exactly. But you produced $1,000 worth of value. So the obvious screaming question is, where does the other $800 go?
Right.
That excess value, the difference between the total value you created and the wage you were paid, is what Wolff calls the surplus.
The surplus.
And here is the defining feature of the capitalist structure. The people who produce that surplus are structurally excluded from deciding what to do with it.
This is the design flaw, or the separation we talked about in the intro. I make the surplus, I exert the effort, but I don't touch that extra $800.
You don't touch it at all.
It bypasses me completely. I don't get a vote on it.
Correct. It is instantly and automatically appropriated by a different group of people.
The appropriators.
Right. In a corporation, this group is the board of directors. They are the appropriators. They receive the surplus.
And they decide what happens to it.
They decide how to distribute it, whether to reinvest in the company, pay it out as dividends to shareholders, pay high executive bonuses, or lobby the government.
And the workers who created the value have zero voice in that allocation process.
Zero. And it's interesting because when you frame it that way, it sounds remarkably similar to previous historical systems.
It really does. In feudalism, the serf worked the land, kept some grain to survive, and the lord took the rest.
And in slavery, the slave worked, got some food to survive, and the master took the rest.
Wolff makes that exact parallel. He argues that capitalism is a continuation of that specific class structure.
It's a division between the producers of surplus and the appropriators of surplus.
We've changed the legal terminology. We don't say lord and serf.
Right, we say employer and employee.
But the flow of value remains structurally identical.
Structurally, yes. The employer owns the product of the employee's labor from the exact moment it is created. The worker never owns the product.
They essentially sell their capacity to work in exchange for the wage.
Yes, and the surplus is the property of the employer.
This leads to a really fascinating and honestly kind of mind-bending point Wolff makes about the 20th century.
The Cold War framing.
Exactly. Because usually when we look back at the Cold War, we see this absolute binary.
The U.S. was capitalist and the Soviet Union was socialist or communist.
That's the story we're told. It's the story of the century. But Wolff applies this surplus analysis to the Soviet Union and comes to a startling conclusion.
It creates a completely different categorization.
How so?
Well, if you look at the Soviet model strictly through the lens of who produces and who appropriates, the structure remains largely the same as the Western model.
In the Soviet Union, the workers still went to a factory.
They still produced a surplus.
And they still had no say in how that surplus was used.
Exactly.
So who was the appropriator in that system?
Because there weren't private shareholders.
Right. There were no private shareholders. The appropriator was the state.
The state itself acted as the board.
Instead of a board of directors elected by private investors, it was a board of state officials appointed by the Communist Party.
But structurally.
They are siblings. Wolff argues they are both forms of capitalism. One is private capitalism, the other is state capitalism.
But in both cases, the relationship between the worker and the surplus is identical.
It is a relationship of alienation. The producer does not control the product. That is a massive reframing.
Yeah.
It shifts the entire focus from who owns the title deed to who sits in the meeting room where the money is allocated.
Exactly. And Wolff argues that the Soviet experiment wasn't a failure of communism per se, but a failure to actually achieve a non-capitalist structure.
They changed the ownership from private to public,
And they changed the distribution from a market to a planned economy.
but they left the production, the daily hierarchy of the workplace, totally intact.
The worker in a Soviet steel mill had just as little say in the disposition of their surplus as a worker in a U.S. steel mill. They both clocked in, took orders, and clocked out.
And that meeting room, that board of directors, holds the key to understanding the economic history of the last century.
Because whoever controls the surplus possesses what Wolff calls the weaponry of the system.
Surplus is more than just profit. It is discretionary power.
It is the resources you use to shape society, to fund political campaigns, to build culture, to buy influence.
And that brings us directly into the historical context. To understand why the incentive architecture looks the way it does today, Wolff argues we have to look back at the Great Depression and the New Deal.
But we have to look at it structurally.
Right.
He frames the New Deal not just as a benevolent policy shift, but as a deal made at gunpoint. Metaphorically speaking, of course.
Let's set the scene for you. It's the 1930s. Capitalism has crashed. Unemployment is hovering around 25%.
You have millions of people marching in the streets.
But it wasn't just marching, right? There was a real organized political threat. This
Yeah.
wasn't just people asking for a few cents more an hour.
No, it was an existential threat to the system. You have
Yeah.
the rise of the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which was organizing labor on a massive scale,
Yeah.
bringing together skilled and unskilled workers.
And alongside them, you had socialist and communist parties that were gaining real traction in American politics.
They were winning elections, they were organizing communities. The board of directors class, the capitalists, were genuinely afraid.
They weren't just afraid of losing money.
They were afraid of losing the entire system. They looked at Russia, they looked at Europe, and they saw that revolution was a real, tangible possibility.
So Franklin D. Roosevelt enters the picture. And he comes from that patrician class. He's wealthy, but he realizes something has to give.
He essentially went to the capitalists and said, I can save you, but it's going to cost you. He offered a deal.
What was the deal?
The deal was the government will create a massive social safety net. We will create Social Security, unemployment insurance, and federal jobs programs. We will allow unions to organize.
And the catch.
We will tax you at very high rates to pay for this.
It was a bribe, in a way. Give up some of the surplus now or lose everything later.
Precisely. And it worked. It stabilized the society. The capitalists grumbled, but they accepted it because the alternative was total collapse or revolution.
And here is the critical structural analysis. Roosevelt left the core structure of the enterprise alone.
This is the pivotal insight. The incentive architecture of the New Deal left the board of directors in place.
The capitalists kept control of production.
They kept the right to appropriate the surplus. They just agreed to hand over a larger chunk of it to the government for redistribution.
So the workers got a better life, higher wages, more security, a path to the middle class.
But they didn't get control. They were still passengers on the bus. They just got better seats and a free lunch.
Wolff argues that this was a fatal flaw in the deal. By leaving the surplus in the hands of the board of directors, the New Deal left the capitalists with the resources to eventually undo the deal.
The surplus is the ammunition. As long as the board controlled the ammunition, it was only a matter of time before they used it to dismantle the regulations and lower the taxes.
They had the incentive, profit maximization, and they retained the means, the surplus, to pursue that incentive.
And that brings us to the breakdown.
Because the deal holds for a while.
It does. We get the post-war boom. The 50s and 60s are often looked back on as this golden age of capitalism where wages rose alongside productivity.
A rising tide lifting all boats.
But then we hit the 1970s, and everything changes. Wolff identifies this as the great pivot point.
Why the 70s? What changed in the mechanics of the machine? Because for a long time, it seemed like the New Deal settled things.
The 1970s represents a perfect storm of structural shifts that altered the incentives for the board of directors.
Okay, break that down for us.
Before the 70s, there was a chronic labor shortage. If you wanted to expand your business, you had to hire, and because labor was scarce, you had to pay well.
Real wages rose because they had to. The workers had leverage simply by supply and demand.
But then three things happened almost simultaneously that destroyed that leverage.
First was technology.
Yes, the computer arrived. Mechanization and automation began to reduce the need for certain types of labor. You didn't need 10 clerks to manage the payroll anymore. You needed one guy and a mainframe.
Second was globalization.
Globalization opened up. Suddenly, the U.S. labor pool wasn't the only pool. Jet travel and telecommunications meant employers could access labor markets in Asia and Latin America.
So if the American worker asks for a raise, the board can now say, we'll just move the factory to Mexico.
Or we'll build the next plant in Taiwan.
Oh, exactly.
The threat became credible.
And the third factor.
A massive demographic shift. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, and the baby boomers hit working age.
So purely in terms of numbers, the supply of labor went through the roof, just as the demand for labor softened due to technology and offshoring.
Basic supply and demand. Labor became cheap.
And this triggered what economists call the Great Divergence.
Yes. From the 1970s onward, productivity, the amount of value a worker produces per hour, kept going up. We got more efficient, better technology, we worked harder.
But real wages, what you can actually buy with your paycheck, went flat.
And they stayed flat for decades.
I want to make sure you really visualize this. Picture two lines on a graph. From 1945 to 1970, they move together, almost parallel. Productivity goes up, wages go up. Then in the mid-70s, the wage line flatlines, moving horizontally across the page. But the productivity line keeps shooting up at a 45-degree angle.
That gap between the lines, the difference between what workers produced and what they were paid, represents an absolute explosion of surplus.
The board of directors suddenly found themselves awash in record-breaking profits.
Not because they were necessarily evil people, but because the structural check on their power, the labor shortage, had evaporated.
They no longer had to share the surplus to keep the business running.
So naturally, following the incentive structure of the system, they didn't.
So the surplus accumulates at the top. But here's the mystery that Wolff points out. If wages went flat in the 70s, why didn't the American economy collapse right then?
It's a great question.
I mean, capitalism needs consumers. If workers aren't getting raises, how are they buying all this stuff that the rising productivity is creating?
This is where we get into the outcomes section of our analysis, and specifically the household crisis. Wolff argues that the American working class, faced with stagnant wages but a culture that promised a constantly rising standard of living, adopted three specific survival mechanisms to close the gap.
They refused to accept a lower standard of living, so they found other ways to pay for it.
Mechanism number one, work more.
Exactly. We saw a dramatic increase in the number of hours worked per person. Second jobs, overtime, the end of the 9-to-5 limitation.
Americans work significantly more hours than their European counterparts, and this divergence really started here. We started selling our leisure time to buy goods.
Mechanism number two, send more people into the fight.
Households shifted from one income earner to two. Now, Wolff notes that women entering the workforce was a victory for social liberation, absolutely. It was a fight for equality and autonomy.
But economically.
Viewed strictly through the lens of household finance, for many families it became a necessity just to maintain the standard of living that one income used to provide in the 1960s.
The dual income trap emerged.
And when those two ran out, when you couldn't work any more hours and you ran out of family members to send to work, we turned to mechanism number three.
Debt.
Debt. This is the crucial stabilizer. From the late 70s through the 2000s, household debt skyrocketed. Mortgages, credit cards, student loans, auto loans.
The gap between what families earned and what they needed to live was bridged by borrowing. We started consuming the future to survive the present.
And this is where the system gets almost diabolically ironic. This is the part of Wolff's analysis that really reveals the underlying structure. We have to talk about the financial feedback loop.
Because who was lending them this money?
Exactly. It is a closed loop, and understanding it is key to understanding the 2008 crash. Let's follow the money.
Step one, workers become more productive, but employers do not raise their wages.
Step two, the employers keep that extra money as surplus profit.
Step three, the employers deposit that profit into the banking and financial system because they have more cash than they know what to do with.
Step four, the banks look for someone to lend that money to generate interest.
And step five,
the banks lend that exact same money back to the workers at interest so the workers can buy the goods they just produced.
it's a surplus recycling mechanism. The workers are essentially borrowing their own unpaid wages.
In a structural sense, yes. The financial sector acted as the bridge. It took the surplus from the corporate accounts and piped it into the household accounts as debt.
This kept the economy looking healthy. Consumption stayed high, profits stayed high, and the stock market boomed.
But it was a house of cards built on the assumption that wages would eventually rise enough to pay off the debt.
But structurally, there was no incentive for wages to rise.
None at all. And this leads us to the invention of asset-backed securities, or ABS. The system became so hungry for this debt that they turned it into a tradable commodity.
They industrialized debt.
They bundled thousands of mortgages or credit card debts into bonds and sold them to investors who, ironically, were often the very corporations sitting on piles of cash from the wage stagnation.
It turned the liability of the working class into an asset for the investing class. It was the ultimate financialization of the workers' distress.
Until, of course, the math stopped working.
The 2007 crash was not an accident. It wasn't just greed or a regulatory oversight.
It was the mathematical limit of this specific design. You cannot sustain an economy indefinitely on stagnant wages and rising debt. Eventually, the workers cannot service the loans.
When the default started, the virtuous circle of rising asset prices turned into a vicious circle of collapse.
And typically, when a system crashes this hard, you expect a correction. You expect the system to say, okay, that didn't work, let's change the design.
But that didn't happen after 2008. If anything, we doubled down. We got bailouts for the banks and austerity for the people.
Which forces the question, why does this system persist even when it clearly fails the majority of the participants?
This brings us back to the persistence of the system and the political capture we touched on earlier.
Remember the lesson from the New Deal. The victor disarms the loser. In the 1930s, the victors momentarily failed to disarm the capitalists. They left them with the surplus.
By 2008, the situation had reversed. The capitalists had spent 30 years using that surplus to capture the regulatory apparatus.
Wolff talks about the taboo here. It's fascinating that in the wake of the greatest employment crisis since the Depression, there was almost zero serious discussion in Washington about a federal jobs program like the WPA.
It was off the table. Completely.
It was structurally invisible. The political system had become so thoroughly dependent on the surplus appropriated by the boards of directors that it could not conceive of a solution that challenged their power.
Both parties accepted the austerity narrative.
The narrative was the government is broke.
The reality was the private sector is hoarding surplus.
A rational system's response would have been to tax the accumulated surplus to fund the recovery. Instead, the cost was shifted to the public via national debt,
Which was then used as a justification to cut social services. It's a feedback loop. Wealth concentrates, political power concentrates, laws are written to favor wealth, wealth concentrates further.
So if regulation fails because the regulators are captured, and if the deal fails because the surplus remains with the board, what is the alternative?
Right. Wolff isn't just diagnosing the illness, he proposes a cure. But it's not a policy cure, it's a structural cure.
He calls it the Workers' Self-Directed Enterprise, or WSDE, and we need to be very precise about what this is and what it isn't.
It is not just profit sharing. It is not just having a suggestion box in the break room. It is a change in the fundamental unit of the enterprise.
In a WSDE, the board of directors as a separate entity is dissolved.
Dissolved entirely.
Correct. The workers are the board of directors. The people who produce the surplus are the same people who appropriate and distribute the surplus.
The separation we identified at the beginning, the design flaw, is removed. The loop is closed.
Now, this gets into the weeds a bit, but it's important. Wolff distinguishes between two types of workers even in this model. You have the surplus producers and the surplus enablers.
Because realistically, not everyone in a company is on the assembly line making the widget. You have the lawyer, the HR rep, the security guard, the janitor.
They provide the conditions for work, but they don't strictly produce the surplus in Marxian terms.
It's a crucial nuance because it addresses the complexity of modern business. You can't just have the assembly line workers running everything without input from the support staff.
Wolff argues that to avoid exploitation, the producers must formally appropriate the surplus. However, the enablers and the producers sit together on the board for general decision-making.
The distribution of that surplus, how much goes to the lawyer, how much to the janitor, is a matter of democratic negotiation between these groups.
It replaces the autocratic decree of a traditional board with the democratic deliberation of the workforce.
I want to play devil's advocate here. Isn't that messy? Democracy is slow, business moves fast. If you have to vote on every single decision, wouldn't these companies just get crushed by traditional hierarchical competitors who can pivot instantly?
That is the most common critique, and it's a valid concern regarding speed. However, Wolff points out that democracy doesn't mean everyone votes on what brand of staples to buy.
Just like in a political democracy, you elect representatives or hire managers.
A WSDE can still have a CEO. They can still have managers. The difference is who they answer to. In a WSDE, the CEO is hired by the workers and can be fired by the workers.
They answer to the floor, not the ceiling.
Exactly. So the management structure exists, but the power flow is inverted. The CEO works for the employees, not the shareholders.
And while decision-making might be more deliberative, the execution is often more efficient because you have total buy-in.
You don't have the friction of a workforce that hates management, sabotages production, or quits constantly. But the real game changer isn't speed, it's the incentives.
Let's look at the incentive architecture of a WSDE versus a corporate firm, because this is where the rubber meets the road. If the workers are the board, how do they make decisions differently? Let's take technology, automation.
This is a classic example. In a capitalist firm, if a machine can do the work of 50 people at half the cost, the board has a clear incentive.
Buy the machine, fire the 50 people, pocket the difference as profit.
The technology is a threat to the worker. It's the enemy.
In a WSDE, the workers are the board. They look at that same machine, they see it creates efficiency, but are they going to vote to fire themselves?
Unlikely. Instead, they might vote to buy the machine and use that efficiency to reduce everyone's work week from 40 hours to 20 hours while keeping their pay the exact same.
Because they capture the efficiency gain. The technology becomes a tool for leisure, not a tool for unemployment.
Exactly. The incentive shifts from accumulation of capital to quality of life. The profit motive is still there. They want the business to succeed, but it's balanced against the well-being of people running it.
Let's look at another incentive: outsourcing. A traditional board sitting in a skyscraper in New York looks at a spreadsheet. They see they can save 20% by moving a factory from Ohio to a region with lower wages and lax environmental laws.
They vote yes. The community in Ohio is devastated, but the board doesn't live in Ohio.
Now, imagine that factory is a WSDE. The board of directors lives in Ohio. Their kids go to the local schools. They drink the local water.
They aren't going to vote to move their own jobs to another continent, and they certainly aren't going to vote to dump toxic waste in the river their kids swim in.
The externalities, pollution, community destruction are internalized because the decision makers are physically and socially embedded in the consequences.
The feedback loop is immediate. You don't pollute your own backyard. This addresses the environmental crisis in a way that regulation struggles to because it aligns the economic incentive with the survival incentive.
And then there's the income disparity issue. We hear about CEOs making 400 times what the average worker makes.
In a WSDE, that pay scale is subject to a Democratic vote. It is highly unlikely that a majority of workers would vote to pay a manager 400 times what they earn.
They might pay them more, maybe 3 times, maybe 5 times to attract talent.
But the natural pressure of the democratic mechanism leads to a compression of the pay gap. This radically reduces the inequality that fuels the political capture we talked about earlier.
So the argument here is that by changing the microstructure of the workplace, you stabilize the macrostructure, the economy, and the democracy.
That is the interconnection. Wolff argues we have a democracy gap. We value democracy in our residents. We vote for mayor, governor, president. But in the place where we spend the most time, we accept total autocracy.
Wolff argues that the workplace is a training ground. If you spend 40 hours a week taking orders, keeping your head down, and feeling powerless, you're being trained to be a passive citizen.
You become cynical. You disengage. You look for a strong man to fix things.
But if you practice democracy at work, if you are negotiating budgets, debating strategy, understanding the trade-offs of the business, you become an active, engaged citizen.
Economic democracy becomes the foundation for political democracy.
It also seems like it would provide macro stability. A WSDE economy wouldn't have that wage stagnation problem because workers wouldn't vote to freeze their own wages while profits skyrocketed.
They would pay themselves the productivity gains, which means consumption would stay strong without needing a massive debt bubble.
Precisely. It aligns production and consumption. The tendency toward a crisis of overproduction where we make too much stuff that no one can afford to buy is dampened because the producers have the income to consume the product.
It's a self-correcting loop rather than a self-destructing one.
So we've looked at the design, the history, the crash, and the alternative. I want to bring this all back to the title of our show. We've covered a lot of ground, but we need to ask the central question. What is the crisis in perception here?
The crisis in perception is that we are continuously trying to solve structural problems with surface-level tools because we are misperceiving the location of the problem.
We think the problem is greed, so we preach morality.
We think the problem is bad policy, so we elect new politicians.
We think the problem is distribution, so we fight over tax rate.
We think the problem is ownership, so we debate private versus public.
But Wolff says we are missing the layer underneath all of that.
We are obscuring the organization of production. As long as the production of surplus and the appropriation of surpluses are separated, the resulting inequality, political capture, and instability are not accidents.
They are mathematical certainties.
The surface interpretation fails because it tries to regulate the board of directors from the outside. But the board controls the resources. The only way to change the outcome is to change the structure from the inside.
We fail to see that true change requires merging the producer and the appropriator. We perceive democracy as a political ritual, when in reality it must be an economic practice.
We're looking at the paint color on the house while the foundation is sliding down the hill.
And until we perceive the foundation, the workplace relationship itself, we will continue to be surprised when the house cracks again.
That is a lot to think about. It really challenges the way we look at our own jobs, our own paychecks, and the economy at large.
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter, visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoyed this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.